Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past unveils its darkest mysteries. They say time buries all things, memories, mistakes, even the people we once loved. But on the outskirts of a quiet American town, there's a family who refused to let time do its work. Their name was Halbert, and their story was never told in full, only whispered behind closed doors, passed down like a warning. The Halberts didn't believe in graves. They believed in keeping their loved ones close, no matter how long they'd been gone. The old Halbert farmhouse still stands, a collapsing structure surrounded by dead trees and silence thick enough to choke on. Locals claim that, on certain nights, a dim light flickers in the upstairs window, and if you get too close, you can smell something sweet, heavy, and wrong. It's been decades since anyone dared step foot inside, but the stories haven't stopped. It began with love, or something that once pretended to be love. The Halberts were known for their isolation, for shunning the town, for tending to their dead themselves. No funeral processions, no church bells. Just closed doors, long nights, and the faint sound of humming that drifted out into the fields. When the last of them vanished, the sheriff expected to find a house full of dust and decay. What he found instead was a family dinner, still perfectly set. Every chair filled. Every face preserved. Every eye open. The story opens with an eerie calm, the kind that blankets a small American town where life moves slow, and secrets decay quietly beneath the soil. The air feels heavy, the fields stretch endlessly, and the roads grow narrower the farther one drives from the center of town. Out there, past the broken fences and leaning barns, the locals whisper about a place they never go after dark, the Halbert property. The introduction must capture that haunting stillness, the tension between what's seen and what's felt, because this is where the story begins, not with screams or storms, but with silence. It's the kind of silence that unsettles more than noise ever could, because beneath it, something is wrong. The houses nearby have lights in their windows, but none reach the Halbert land. The air there seems colder, and even the crickets fall quiet as if nature itself refuses to trespass. It's the perfect stage for a secret to rot in plain sight. Every town has its stories, passed down from generation to generation, stories meant to entertain, frighten, or warn. But the whispers about the Halberts don't sound like stories, they sound like memories. The people who talk about them don't smile. They glance around, lower their voices, and choose their words carefully, as if speaking their name too loudly might wake something that's been asleep for too long. The tone is not one of fantasy but of grim recollection, of something that truly happened and was never properly put to rest. The Halbert name carries weight, and everyone who's lived in that town long enough knows to leave it buried in conversation, even if the family never buried anything themselves. In that unsettling quiet, the audience is drawn into the macabre mood of the tale. The visuals build slowly, a pale sunrise bleeding through mist, an empty road stretching toward a shadowed farmhouse, the faint sound of wind brushing through the weeds. There's no need for monsters here, the setting does the haunting on its own. The introduction establishes atmosphere before it ever mentions the family, because the place is as much a character as they are. It breathes, it remembers, and it waits. The story's tension doesn't explode, it seeps, creeping into the edges of comfort until the viewer feels trapped in that forgotten town, hearing the same quiet that once surrounded the Halberts. But what if the silence wasn't empty, but waiting? The first clue that something was deeply wrong with the Halberts didn't come from a scream, but from a smell the mail carriers could never wash away. The Halbert family existed like a rumor given flesh, present, but never entirely real to the people who lived around them. They were the kind of family that everyone in town knew about but no one truly knew. Their lineage stretched back farther than most could remember, older than the paved roads, older even than the town's name itself. The Halberts had lived on that same patch of land for generations, their property bordered by wild trees and silence, their house standing like a monument to time that refused to move forward. To outsiders, they seemed withdrawn, peculiar perhaps, but not dangerous. Yet, the more one learned about them, the clearer it became that their solitude wasn't simply a preference, it was protection, both from the world and for the strange beliefs that defined their way of life. The Halberts didn't come into town often. When they did, it was always for necessities, flour, kerosene, medicine, and they never lingered. Their clothes were outdated, their eyes pale and tired, their voices soft but distant, as though they were always half elsewhere. People noticed how they avoided conversation, how they never mentioned friends, church, or neighbors. There was an aura about them that made even the most talkative shopkeeper shorten their words. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense of intrusion, like speaking too long to a Halbert meant trespassing into something sacred or forbidden. Children would stare at them when they passed, and parents would pull them close, whispering to never ask questions about that family. The Halbert property was their fortress. They built their lives behind its gates, surrounded by towering oaks and untrimmed hedges that grew thicker with every passing year. The longer they lived in isolation, the stranger the rumors became. Some said the Halberts were protecting a fortune, others believed they were hiding a curse. At night, when faint lights flickered from their windows, townsfolk would swear they heard faint voices, not speaking, but humming, slow and mournful, like a lullaby with no words. The truth, however, was far stranger. Their isolation wasn't born of secrecy alone, it was devotion. The Halberts believed that death didn't have to be a separation, that the bond between blood could transcend decay. Their reclusiveness was not simply a habit but a practice, an entire way of life centered around keeping their own close, even after life had supposedly let them go. And so they stayed apart, their home becoming both sanctuary and tomb, as the rest of the town learned to live without asking what kept the Halberts company when the night fell silent. The Halbert farmhouse stood at the edge of a forgotten cemetery, where the grass grew high and the wind never stopped whispering through the cracks of broken headstones. The house itself was a monument of neglect, its paint long stripped by the elements, its roof sagging under years of quiet decay. It loomed at the end of a dirt path no one used anymore, surrounded by fields that seemed to have lost their color. The cemetery beside it wasn't on any official map, though the oldest residents of town swore it had once been used before the war, before records were properly kept. It was said that the Halberts had chosen that land deliberately, not out of convenience, but conviction. The dead, to them, were never meant to be left alone, and so they lived among them, or rather, refused to let them go. On grey mornings, when fog rolled in from the marshes, the farmhouse and the cemetery appeared as one, as if the boundary between the living and the dead had blurred into a single shape. The iron gate that marked the entrance to the graveyard had long rusted shut, but a narrow path led directly from the Halberts' back porch into the graves. Locals passing by on horseback decades ago claimed they had seen small figures moving there at dusk, lanterns swaying like fireflies among the stones. But when they looked again, the lights were gone, replaced by shadows that didn't seem to move with the wind. The farmhouse absorbed these stories the way old wood absorbs moisture, until its walls felt saturated with the weight of superstition. The windows of the house were tall but heavily draped, and no one could ever recall seeing them open. Some said it was to keep the sunlight out, others whispered it was to keep something in. From a distance, the house looked lifeless, yet there was always a faint flicker behind the curtains, a candle, perhaps, or something pretending to be one. The smell that lingered around the property was strange, a mixture of old wood, damp soil, and something faintly metallic. It was the kind of scent that didn't belong to the living. Even the animals avoided that stretch of land. Birds would circle high but never perch on the roof, and stray dogs were known to whimper and turn back before reaching the gate. To anyone else, this house was ruin, but to the Halberts, it was sacred ground, the meeting place of memory and mortality, where the cemetery wasn't a resting place, but a gathering one. The town's fear was about to be justified when a local boy, on a dare, saw what was hidden inside the house, a sight that would change everything and send him running, never to return. As the years went by, the Halbert property became the center of countless whispered tales, each one darker than the last. In the town's diners and along the narrow main street, people spoke of the strange lights that flickered across the Halbert fields at night, faint and yellow like the glow of an old lantern carried by invisible hands. No one ever saw who held them, yet they moved with purpose, weaving between the trees, pausing near the edge of the forgotten cemetery, then vanishing all at once. Some said the lights were a trick of fog or swamp gas, others claimed they were something far older, the restless spirits of those who had been denied burial. But the most unsettling stories weren't about the lights at all. They were about the voices. The voices began as faint murmurs, drifting through the fields on windless nights. People who lived close by said they would hear them just before sleep, low, melodic, almost like chanting. At first it seemed harmless, the kind of sound a tired mind invents in silence. But then the voices grew clearer, louder, and they didn't fade with distance. Those who dared to walk near the property said it felt as though the air itself was alive, humming with a language they couldn't recognize but somehow understood. A local mail carrier once swore he heard laughter coming from the Halbert porch long after midnight, though no one had been seen entering or leaving for weeks. Another claimed to hear a woman softly singing, a tune so sorrowful it made him cry without knowing why. The townspeople stopped venturing past the old oak that marked the beginning of Halbert land. They said the voices called out names, not random ones, but the names of the living, people who still resided in town. Those who heard their names spoken said it came from every direction at once, 1,000 whispers converging into a single breath. Superstition turned quickly into fear, and fear became silence. No one mentioned the Halberts openly anymore, as if the mere act of acknowledging them might draw attention. Every light in those fields, every strange sound carried through the night, became part of the town's quiet mythology. The Halberts themselves never denied nor explained it, they never came forward to ease the growing unease. The lights continued, the voices persisted, and the distance between the living and the dead in that place seemed to thin just a little more with every passing night, until it was impossible to tell which side the Halberts truly belonged to. The Halberts were rarely seen, and when they were, something about them made people look twice. They appeared in town only when absolutely necessary, during daylight, when the streets were busy, and always together, as if the presence of one required the others to feel whole. They moved quietly, their steps measured, their expressions blank, as though they were performing the act of living rather than experiencing it. Their skin was pale, not with the softness of illness but with the cold stillness of stone. Their eyes, sunken and distant, seemed to look past people rather than at them, focused on something no one else could see. Conversations with them felt disjointed, delayed, as if they were answering questions that hadn't been asked aloud. Those brief encounters left behind an unease that lingered long after they walked away. The townsfolk whispered that the Halberts were touched by misfortune, cursed perhaps, but what unnerved people most wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. Their voices were soft and oddly deliberate, every word carefully placed, as though they feared saying too much or saying it wrong. They never smiled, not even politely, and no one could recall ever seeing one of them laugh. They were always clean but oddly formal, wearing dark clothes even in the heat of summer. The older ones wore heavy coats with long sleeves, while the younger members often kept gloves on, their fingers hidden no matter the weather. When the Halberts entered a store, conversations quieted without anyone realizing it. The room felt colder, time seemed to stretch, and then, as quickly as they arrived, they were gone, vanishing back toward the dirt road that led to their property. The shopkeepers would glance at each other afterward, half expecting to find something changed, but everything remained exactly as it had been except for the faint scent they always left behind, something like wilted flowers and candle smoke. No one in town could recall ever shaking a Halbert's hand or hearing them speak of the past. They lived as though detached from time, their presence an echo of something older, something that didn't quite belong. Rumors spread that they mourned someone who had died long ago, yet never stopped grieving. Some claimed they saw faces in the windows of the Halbert house that didn't match the number of people seen in town. Others said the family was growing thinner each year, as if their connection to the living world was slowly fading. Whatever the truth was, one thing remained certain: every glimpse of a Halbert carried a feeling that death had already claimed them, and they simply hadn't realized it yet. The local sheriff had always felt a quiet unease about the Halbert family, though there was never anything solid to act upon. Complaints had trickled in over the years, faint smells drifting through the fields, strange lights moving behind curtained windows, the sound of voices carried on still nights, but when he went to investigate, the evidence always dissolved into nothing. Each visit ended the same way: polite conversation on the porch, a few hollow smiles, and a sense that he was being humored rather than respected. The Halberts had a way of making the ordinary feel off balance. Their words were calm, but their eyes betrayed something else, something unspoken, as if they were guarding a truth too heavy to share. The sheriff couldn't explain why their presence unsettled him, only that it did, and that every instinct told him there was something in that house he wasn't meant to see. He tried to dismiss the stories as superstition. Small towns breed rumors the way fields grow weeds, and the Halberts, with their isolation and strange habits, were an easy target. But the consistency of the reports began to bother him. Different people, from different parts of town, described the same things: lights, smells, and once, even faint music. It was never loud or chaotic, it was rhythmic, deliberate, like a ritual. He made excuses at first, saying it was old wiring, lanterns, or perhaps the family holding on to odd traditions. Yet when he passed by their property at night, the hair on his arms would rise before he even reached the gate. Something about that land rejected intrusion. He once asked the town records clerk about burials, hoping to find something concrete: certificates, grave plots, anything that might explain the whispers of death that seemed to follow the family. But the names of the deceased Halberts were only ever listed under home burial, with no locations, no confirmations. The clerk couldn't even recall seeing a Halbert funeral. They simply stopped appearing in town, one by one, and no one could ever say for certain when. The sheriff drove out there one last time after a heavy storm had washed through the valley. The road was soft and narrow, and the trees bent low as though listening. When he arrived, the house looked unchanged, though smoke curled faintly from its chimney, and the faint smell of formaldehyde hung in the damp air. He knocked, but no one answered. Standing there, with the fields silent and the world unnaturally still, he realized that unease wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was warning. Something about that house didn't want to be disturbed, and the sheriff, though a man of logic, found himself obeying that unspoken command. The mystery deepened to a terrifying degree when the sheriff checked the town records and discovered a horrifying fact: the Halberts documented their dead, but no graves existed for any of them. The first real suspicion began with a rumor that no one could trace to its source, a whisper that the coffins leaving the Halbert property were empty. It started quietly, as these things do, murmured by a gravedigger who claimed the weight wasn't right, that the sound inside was hollow when the wood was lifted. Then it was repeated by a church attendant who said the Halberts hadn't requested a priest in years, not even when the death of the matriarch was announced. Soon the entire town was caught in a web of speculation. If the coffins didn't hold the dead, then where were they? And if the Halberts were not burying their loved ones, what were they doing instead? No one had ever seen a funeral procession leave their property. They handled everything privately, insisting on caring for their own. The local undertaker, a man named Brooks, recalled once being invited to the Halbert home to assist after a supposed passing. He was a practical man, not one to entertain gossip, but the experience left him shaken. He told his wife he would never return there, and he never did. When pressed for details, he said only that the Halberts had their own ways, and that he had no right to interfere. Weeks later, Brooks closed his shop early one evening and left town without a word. His disappearance added weight to the stories, as if his silence confirmed what others dared not say aloud. Neighbors claimed they had seen wagons leaving the property under the cover of darkness, carrying what looked like caskets. But the wagons never reached the churchyard or the town cemetery. They vanished into the woods, where the road curved sharply and the trees grew too dense to follow. When morning came, the same wagons were seen returning, lighter, empty, their drivers expressionless. The Halberts never explained. They never denied it either. They simply continued as though nothing was amiss, their black curtains drawn tight, their chimneys still smoking. The rumor grew into conviction. People began to believe the Halberts were keeping their dead, preserving them, perhaps, or refusing to let them rest. Some said it was grief that drove them to madness, others thought it was faith twisted into something unnatural. Whatever the truth, the idea of coffins without bodies became a symbol of everything the town feared about them, that their love for the dead had crossed a boundary no one was meant to cross. The image of those empty boxes lingered in the minds of the townspeople like an unfinished sentence, one that ended not with closure, but with dread. The more the town searched for answers, the more unsettling the truth became. Every time someone in the Halbert family was said to have died, the death was properly recorded, names entered in ledgers, dates written in careful ink, yet not one of those names appeared in the cemetery records. The churchyards had no headstones, no burial plots, no markers of mourning to match the paper trail. It was as though the Halberts' dead simply vanished, acknowledged only by ink and memory but never by earth. The town clerk, a patient man accustomed to paperwork errors, tried for months to reconcile the discrepancies. He checked archives, contacted nearby parishes, even searched through decades of burial maps, but the pattern never changed. Every Halbert death was documented, and every grave that should have accompanied it did not exist. At first, people thought it might be a clerical issue, that perhaps the Halberts had private grounds where they buried their family in accordance with older traditions. Home burials were not unheard of in the region, especially among families with land to spare and a distrust of outsiders. But when the sheriff and the local pastor visited the property to request a record of such burials, they were politely turned away at the gate. The eldest Halbert, a thin man with calm eyes and a voice barely louder than a whisper, insisted that their family handled their own affairs and that all was in order. He spoke with a dignity that left no room for argument. The sheriff noted that there was no sign of fresh soil anywhere on the property, no visible grave markers, and certainly no evidence of digging. Yet there was also nothing illegal, nothing tangible he could act upon. Over time, the townspeople accepted the absence of graves as another oddity in a long list of Halbert peculiarities. Still, it bothered them in a quiet, persistent way. The idea of death without burial felt unnatural, like a story with no ending. Some whispered that the family didn't believe in graves at all, that they viewed burial as a kind of betrayal, the act of putting distance between the living and the dead. Others thought something darker was at play, that perhaps the Halberts didn't bury their dead because they couldn't. The idea unsettled even the most practical minds, because if the dead weren't in the ground, then they were somewhere else. And if they were somewhere else, they might still be waiting, watching, or walking through that crumbling house on the edge of the forgotten cemetery. The mail carriers were among the few people who approached the Halbert property regularly, and even they began to dread the task. At first, their complaints were small: a sense of unease, the way the air felt thick and damp near the gate, the silence that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. But then came something they couldn't ignore. They began reporting a smell that lingered near the property, one that clung to their clothes and refused to fade no matter how hard they tried to wash it away. It wasn't the sharp scent of decay they described, but something far more complicated, sweet at first, almost floral, then heavy, chemical, and metallic beneath. It reminded them of old hospitals, of flowers left too long beside a dying patient, of something that should have been buried but wasn't. One carrier, a young man who had just taken over the route, described how the smell grew stronger in the summer heat. On certain days, when the wind shifted, it would drift down the road, faint but undeniable. He said it seemed to pulse with the air, as if it were alive, carrying with it a faint bitterness that caught in the throat. He had seen strange stains on the Halberts' back porch once, dark and glossy like oil, but he convinced himself it was nothing more than spilled varnish. The next week, the stains were gone, yet the smell had worsened. Another carrier, older and skeptical of town gossip, admitted that the odor changed depending on the time of day, sharper in the morning, fainter by dusk, as though something inside the house was being tended to, perhaps hidden. The townsfolk noticed it too when the wind blew just right. Those living nearest to the Halberts began to keep their windows closed, claiming the scent made them dizzy, even nauseous. Some compared it to formaldehyde, others said it was like the perfume of lilies mixed with rot. The sheriff investigated more than once, but each visit ended the same way: a polite greeting, a firm refusal to enter, and no tangible evidence of wrongdoing. The Halberts maintained that the smell came from the swamp behind their land, a natural odor of stagnant water and decay. But even those who wanted to believe that explanation couldn't ignore what their instincts told them, that the scent was too focused, too deliberate, as if it came from within the walls themselves. The mail carriers eventually started leaving letters at the edge of the road, unwilling to walk the final stretch. They said the air there pressed too close, heavy with something that felt both chemical and human, something that didn't belong to the living world anymore. The Halberts' strange behavior began to take on a darker meaning once people started learning about their beliefs, not religious in the traditional sense, but something far older and more unsettling. The family's obsession with spiritual preservation was not just an eccentricity, it was a guiding principle. They believed death was not an ending but a transformation, a state of being that could be controlled if handled properly. To them, the body was not a vessel to be discarded but a sacred shell that could still house the essence of a loved one. Burial, in their view, was an act of abandonment. The Halberts rejected the idea that decay was natural, insisting that love demanded intervention, that the separation between the living and the dead existed only because the living chose to let go. Neighbors who spoke with the elder Halbert recalled his calm yet chilling way of discussing mortality. He said the soul was like wax, it could melt, it could reshape, but with care, it could be preserved. He viewed death as a condition to be managed, not mourned. The family's home reflected this belief: curtains drawn tight to keep out sunlight, rooms unnaturally cool even in summer, the faint scent of antiseptic and flowers seeping through the air. Visitors who had reason to enter said it felt more like a mausoleum than a house, a place where time refused to move forward. Every piece of furniture was polished, every portrait perfectly dusted, yet there was no warmth in the upkeep. It was as though the Halberts were maintaining a museum dedicated to their own existence. Their devotion to denying decay extended beyond philosophy. The patriarch was rumored to have studied early embalming techniques, experimenting with mixtures of oils, salts, and chemicals. He ordered medical supplies that puzzled the town pharmacist: jars of formalin, odd instruments, and sheets of linen stained faintly yellow. When questioned, he spoke of preservation in vague, almost poetic terms. He claimed that the soul lingered near what it loved most, and that by preserving the body, one could give it a place to stay. The idea seemed harmless at first, the ramblings of a man who feared loss, but the implications unsettled everyone who heard them. Over time, the Halberts' obsession grew into a kind of ritual, a family creed that guided every action. They were no longer just mourning their dead, they were trying to keep them. What began as devotion blurred into delusion, and what started as faith became something colder, something clinical. Their house turned into a sanctuary for the departed, a place where the line between reverence and horror was not only crossed but carefully maintained. The town was about to discover the horrifying truth behind the Halberts' beliefs, a truth so disturbing it would confirm their darkest fears about what was happening inside the house. Rumors about what truly happened inside the Halbert residence reached their peak when a local boy, daring his friends, sneaked into the estate one late autumn evening. He didn't make it far before he came running back, pale and stammering about people in glass boxes. At first, no one believed him, but the story spread quickly, fueled by the town's long-held suspicion that the Halberts were hiding something grotesque. Some dismissed it as childish exaggeration, yet others noticed how certain windows of the house always seemed fogged from the inside, even in the dead of winter. The boy claimed he saw what looked like bodies, perfectly still, perfectly dressed, lying in open coffins or encased in something that glimmered like glass or resin. The image lodged itself deep in the town's collective imagination, and from then on, no one saw the Halberts in the same way again. The police, pressured by whispers and accusations, attempted to investigate, but the Halberts were clever and fiercely private. They allowed the authorities only into certain rooms, all of which appeared impeccably normal, almost too normal. Everything was polished, sterile, and silent. The smell of chemicals hung faintly in the air, like a hospital mixed with old flowers. There were no signs of foul play, but there was a feeling, an oppressive unease that seemed to cling to anyone who entered. Some officers later admitted that they left not because they found nothing, but because they didn't want to see what they might. The Halberts had a way of watching people, their eyes calm but unblinking, their smiles stretched just enough to make visitors uneasy. After the visit, the family withdrew even further from public view. Deliveries were made at night, curtains remained drawn at all hours, and even the once friendly housekeeper was no longer seen. Yet the same dim light continued to flicker in the upper rooms, and on quiet nights, locals swore they could hear what sounded like soft humming, or the faint creak of floorboards, not hurried, not chaotic, but rhythmic, almost ritualistic. Some speculated that the family was performing ceremonies to communicate with their dead, while others believed the bodies themselves were part of a preservation experiment gone too far. The boy who started it all moved away with his family soon after, claiming he couldn't sleep without seeing those faces again, pale, serene, and perfectly preserved behind glass. Whether his story was true or born from fear hardly mattered, the damage was done. The Halberts' reputation was sealed, and the once grand estate became a place no one dared to approach after dusk. It wasn't until the winter of 1964 that the Halbert estate would once again draw the attention of outsiders, this time not from rumor but from tragedy. A severe snowstorm swept through the region, collapsing roofs, cutting power lines, and isolating towns for days. When the storm cleared, the Halberts' mansion stood eerily untouched, as though the weather had bent around it. But what truly disturbed the townspeople was the thick column of black smoke that began to rise from its chimneys, steady, unbroken, and oddly sweet-smelling, unlike any normal wood fire. Neighbors who ventured close enough to see described a strange glow coming from the basement windows, a flickering amber light that pulsed slowly, almost like a heartbeat. No one dared knock on the door, but whispers spread like wildfire that the Halberts were burning something or someone. Days later, when the smoke finally stopped, the smell lingered across the valley for nearly a week. It was said to carry an undertone of formaldehyde and rot, a scent that clung to the clothes and hair of anyone who passed too near. Concerned by the rumors, a small group of townspeople gathered the courage to approach the estate, claiming they wanted to offer help after the storm. The front door stood slightly ajar, but no one answered their calls. Inside, the air was warm and thick, heavy with incense and decay. The grand hall looked the same as it always had, pristine, still, and suffocatingly perfect, but something had changed. The family portraits that once lined the staircase were gone, replaced by empty frames. In the center of the room stood several sealed crates, each marked with a red wax symbol no one recognized. They didn't open them. They simply backed away and left, swearing to never return. What happened after that became the stuff of folklore. Some said the Halberts were conducting cremations of their preserved dead, finally attempting to release the souls they had kept trapped for so long. Others believed the smoke was part of a darker ritual, a way to transform the bodies into something else entirely, neither living nor dead. The local sheriff, when pressed to investigate, refused to go near the property, dismissing the stories as hysteria, though his hands reportedly trembled as he spoke. The mansion remained sealed again after that, with no lights, no movement, and no sign of the family. Yet at night, the faint hum of the furnace could still be heard beneath the snow, echoing through the hollow hills like a dying heartbeat that refused to stop. By the spring of 1965, curiosity turned into fear when letters began appearing in the mailboxes of nearby residents, handwritten, stamped from the Halbert estate, and signed simply EH. The envelopes were yellowed and carried a faint smell of lavender mixed with something metallic. Inside, each letter contained only a few sentences, strange and fragmented, as though written by someone teetering between reality and delirium. "They are not gone," one letter read. "They sleep in glass, and the glass remembers their names." Another said, "The cold preserves, but love sustains. You wouldn't understand what it means to keep what's yours forever." Some recipients dismissed them as cruel pranks, but others noticed that each letter was addressed not to a person, but to a family name as though the writer were reaching out to entire bloodlines rather than individuals. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and distinctly old-fashioned, written in dark brown ink that looked more like dried blood than pen. When investigators traced the postmarks, they found they had indeed originated from the Halbert property. But when they went to check, the house was empty, sealed from the inside, with no sign that anyone had lived there for months. The fireplaces were cold, the food in the pantry untouched, yet fresh footprints, small, narrow ones, were visible in the thin layer of dust across the marble floor. It was as though someone had walked through recently, carefully avoiding disturbing anything else. Even more unsettling, on a desk near the front hall sat an open ledger filled with names, dates, and short annotations. Many of the names matched those of the letter recipients. Next to each name, a single word was written: prepared. The discovery caused panic in the small town. Some families packed up and left entirely, fearing they were part of some deranged ritual. Others burned the letters, believing them cursed. A few brave souls tried to decode the pattern, searching for meaning in the list of names, but the ledger was eventually taken by authorities and never seen again. Official reports labeled the incident a hoax, though no one ever claimed responsibility, and the handwriting was never matched to any known person. Yet strange occurrences continued: pets disappearing near the Halbert property, flickering lights in the windows late at night, and the echo of faint music, an old phonograph tune drifting across the fields. Locals said it was the Halberts reaching out, sending messages from a place between life and death, bound by a promise to never let their dead go. Just when the town thought the horror was over, a team of contractors would make a discovery inside the mansion so chilling, it would rewrite the entire Halbert legend. Summer arrived with an uneasy stillness around the Halbert estate, the kind of oppressive calm that feels like the world is holding its breath. After months of eerie silence, a team of contractors from a nearby city was hired to assess the property for potential sale. The Halbert mansion had sat abandoned long enough for its roof to begin sagging, ivy to devour its walls, and rumors to root themselves deeper than any vine. When the team arrived, they expected a ruin, but what they found was a place frozen in time, preserved as though someone had locked the moment they left inside glass. Dust lay evenly across every surface, yet the air smelled faintly of chemicals and wilted roses. The clock still ticked, faintly and irregularly, and on the kitchen table sat a set of porcelain teacups, arranged neatly as if waiting for guests who never arrived. The workers split up to inspect different areas, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. In the parlor, one man reportedly stopped in his tracks when his light fell on what looked like a figure seated in an armchair. It was an elderly woman, dressed in fine lace, her posture unnaturally straight, her eyes closed. Thinking she was a mannequin, he reached out to adjust the lamp beside her, only to recoil when he noticed the faint texture of skin under a layer of varnish-like coating. What he had thought was wax was in fact human flesh, hardened and glistening. The others rushed in, and together they discovered that the figure was not alone. 3 more bodies were arranged throughout the room, a young man at the piano, a woman beside a phonograph, and a child holding a small wooden toy. Each figure was perfectly preserved, dressed immaculately, their expressions peaceful, as though merely resting. Authorities were called immediately, and the estate was sealed off. When investigators examined the remains, they confirmed what many had feared for years: these were the Halberts. But the preservation defied all explanation. Their bodies were intact, showing no signs of decay despite the years that had passed. Tests revealed traces of embalming fluid and resin, but not in any quantity or combination that matched standard mortuary practices. It was as if someone had discovered a method of halting death mid-breath, suspending life in a state between mortality and memory. The discovery reignited the old whispers, transforming them into something darker. Perhaps the Halberts had never buried their dead because they had found a way to keep them forever. The estate was never sold, and those who entered it afterward swore the air hummed faintly, like the low murmur of voices carried through walls that still remembered. News of the Halbert discovery spread quickly, attracting journalists, historians, and even scientists who wanted to witness what was being called the House of the Unburied. Within weeks, the quiet town was overrun by outsiders carrying cameras, notebooks, and instruments. Reporters described the mansion as both beautiful and terrifying, a place where time itself seemed reluctant to move forward. Photographs taken of the preserved family members were published in tabloids, but many were quickly retracted when readers complained of feeling nauseated or uneasy after looking at them. The images were said to hold a strange stillness, as though the subject's eyes might open if you stared too long. Some skeptics claimed the Halberts had been part of a bizarre art project or scientific experiment, while others whispered of witchcraft and alchemy. The official investigation yielded nothing conclusive, but what unnerved everyone most was that no one could determine how the preservation had been achieved or when exactly the family had died. During the investigation, one forensic specialist noted that the bodies showed signs of care long after death. Fingernails were trimmed, hair neatly brushed, clothes replaced seasonally with new garments. This suggested that someone, perhaps a remaining Halbert or a devoted caretaker, had continued tending to them for years after their deaths. Yet there was no trace of anyone living in the house, no fresh food, no laundry, no footprints beyond those of the workers who had discovered the remains. The entire scene seemed staged for eternity, as though the family had prepared themselves to be found exactly this way. Their final tableau was too deliberate, too graceful, to be accidental. As news outlets fought for access, local authorities cordoned off the property and ordered the removal of the bodies for proper burial. But when the attempt was made, strange things occurred. The preservation materials had fused the corpses to their surroundings, almost as if the house itself refused to release them. Furniture cracked, glass shattered, and the air turned unbearably cold. Workers swore they heard faint whispers echoing from the upper floors, though no one was there. After 2 failed attempts, the project was abandoned, and the mansion was declared condemned. In the years that followed, the estate was left untouched, swallowed by vines and silence. But those who passed by said that on certain nights, when the wind blew through the valley, the faint sound of a piano could be heard drifting from the parlor, one last song for the family that never left their home or their dead. Not long after the failed attempt to remove the preserved bodies from the Halbert estate, those involved in the investigation began to experience a series of strange and unsettling events that seemed to follow them far beyond the property. The first to report anything unusual was one of the contractors who had initially discovered the bodies. He claimed that for weeks afterward, he would wake up at exactly 3:11 a.m. each night to the faint sound of knocking, slow, deliberate, and always 3 times, coming from somewhere inside his house. When he finally gathered the courage to investigate, he found nothing, but his tools, which he kept neatly organized in his garage, had been moved or rearranged into neat, symmetrical patterns, just like the furnishings inside the Halbert mansion. Not long after, he was found dead in his sleep, with no sign of foul play, his expression eerily calm. Others who had stepped foot inside the estate reported similar experiences. A journalist claimed she began finding dried flower petals scattered across her desk each morning, though she hadn't kept any flowers in her home. A police officer involved in the case said his radio would crackle late at night with faint whispers, soft voices reciting names from the ledger discovered in the house months earlier. Even the coroner who examined the Halbert remains resigned from his position after what he described as a series of persistent visions of glass coffins and faces behind them, mouthing words he couldn't hear. When questioned, he refused to elaborate further, simply saying that some things didn't want to be disturbed. Word of these incidents began to circulate, but officials quickly dismissed them as stress-related or coincidental. Yet, the townspeople noticed that nearly everyone who entered the Halbert property eventually left the town entirely or vanished. The mansion gained a new reputation, not just as a place of death, but as something sentient, something capable of holding on to those who trespassed against its quiet order. Locals began referring to it as the house that keeps its guests. Over time, even approaching the estate became taboo. Travelers who dared to stop nearby spoke of an unnatural chill that surrounded the grounds, regardless of the season, and of windows that seemed to faintly glow from within, as if lit by candlelight long after the flames had died. Whatever had begun inside that house, the Halberts' obsession with preservation, their refusal to let death take its due, had not ended with them. It had lingered, patient and unyielding, waiting for anyone who tried to uncover what should have been left buried. The horror of the Halbert house was not confined to its walls, as those who entered soon learned when a strange and terrifying curse began to follow them home. Years after the events surrounding the Halbert estate faded from newspaper headlines, the mansion still stood like a scar on the landscape, untouched, unclaimed, and avoided by all who knew its story. Nature tried to reclaim it, but even that seemed to happen unnaturally slowly, as if the earth itself was hesitant to disturb what rested there. Ivy crept up the walls but never reached the windows. The trees surrounding the property grew tall and twisted, their branches leaning away from the house instead of toward it. One winter, a group of university students studying paranormal phenomena decided to visit the estate, determined to document what they believed were exaggerated tales. They arrived with cameras, recorders, and scientific instruments, laughing as they stepped through the threshold of the decaying home. None of them were laughing by nightfall. Their footage, later recovered by local authorities, revealed something deeply unsettling. At first, the recordings showed nothing more than a decaying interior, dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the faint glimmer of resin on surfaces where the bodies had once been found. But as the night wore on, the footage began to distort. One student could be heard whispering that she felt someone standing behind her, though the others insisted she was alone. In another clip, a reflection in a cracked mirror briefly showed an unfamiliar figure, a woman in period clothing, standing perfectly still. The most chilling moment came near the end, when their flashlight beams passed over the piano in the parlor. For a brief instant, the keys moved on their own, pressing down in slow succession, playing a faint, broken melody. Moments later, the footage ended abruptly, cutting to static. When police entered the house days later, all of the students' equipment was still there, but the students themselves were gone. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leaving the property, just silence. Their car remained parked on the road, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. The disappearance reignited the local legend, fueling the belief that the Halberts' home had become a vessel for whatever force they had awakened. Some believed the family's preservation ritual had bound their souls to the property, while others claimed the house itself had become sentient, a guardian of its own secrets, feeding on curiosity. Even after extensive searches, nothing was found. But the recovered footage, grainy and incomplete, continued to circulate in hushed corners of the internet, where late-night viewers claimed to hear faint knocking in the background, always 3 times, just before the tape went silent. By the early 1980s, the Halbert estate had become a forbidden landmark, a monument to both fascination and fear. The town's younger generation grew up hearing stories about the family who never buried their dead, and like all ghost tales, it became a rite of passage to test the legend's truth. Groups of teenagers would sneak onto the property after dark, daring each other to touch the front door or peer through a window. Most returned shaken but unharmed, describing only the suffocating stillness and the way their voices seemed to echo back to them in distorted tones. But in 1982, something changed. A group of 4 friends went to the mansion on Halloween night, laughing and recording themselves on a handheld camcorder. Only one of them made it back, and what he told police left them questioning whether he had truly survived at all. According to his statement, the group had entered through the back door, which hung slightly open as though waiting for them. The house was silent except for a faint ticking sound that seemed to come from every wall. They wandered through the dusty halls, filming everything, until they reached the parlor. There, the boy claimed, the air grew so cold he could see his breath. The piano stood untouched, but on top of it lay a small glass box filled with white powder. One of the friends, jokingly, tapped the box, and that's when the lights from their camera began to flicker. He said they heard footsteps from the 2nd floor, slow, deliberate, as though someone were descending to meet them. Then came a voice, faint but distinct, calling one of their names. The next thing he remembered was waking up outside the house alone, his clothes damp with condensation, his friends gone. The tape recovered from his camera was damaged beyond repair, but investigators later claimed to have heard faint breathing and a soft humming in the background when they tried to restore the audio. The survivor left town shortly after, refusing to speak about that night again. The police found no trace of the missing teens despite multiple searches. In the following years, no one dared to approach the property again. The house seemed to feed on the fear it generated, growing darker and quieter with each passing decade. Locals began to say that the Halberts' legacy was no longer about death, but about invitation, that the house called to those who didn't believe, luring them in so it could show them what happens when death is defied for too long. And after that Halloween, no one in the town ever doubted that the Halbert mansion was still alive, watching, and waiting for the next knock on its door. In the late 1990s, nearly 2 decades after the last reported incident at the Halbert estate, the mansion was purchased by a distant relative, a man named Charles Halbert, who claimed to be researching his ancestry. He was a reclusive academic, specializing in mortuary science and preservation techniques, which immediately reignited local unease. Few had the courage to speak to him directly, but those who did described him as polite, articulate, and strangely detached, as if his mind were fixed on something far away. He arrived alone, bringing with him crates of scientific equipment, antique books, and several sealed containers marked with symbols no one recognized. Within weeks, lights began glowing once more in the mansion's upper floors, and the faint hum of machinery could be heard at odd hours of the night. Some believed he was restoring the house, but others whispered that he was continuing the work his ancestors had started. Charles rarely left the property, and when he did, he was always seen wearing thick gloves and a long coat, even in the heat of summer. Delivery drivers reported that he only accepted shipments after sunset and that the packages they dropped off sometimes emitted a low, mechanical hum. Strange odors, a mix of formaldehyde, ozone, and something sweetly decayed, began to drift downwind from the estate. Locals grew increasingly anxious, recalling the stories their parents had told them. Then, one night, a loud electrical surge caused a temporary blackout across the valley. When power was restored, several residents swore they saw a faint golden light pulsing from the mansion's windows, synchronized with what sounded like a human heartbeat amplified through the air. Weeks later, Charles vanished. The mail piled up, deliveries went uncollected, and the lights inside the mansion stopped glowing. When authorities finally entered the property, they found it meticulously organized rooms filled with glass tanks, medical instruments, and hundreds of pages of handwritten notes. On the desk in the study lay a single journal, open to the last page. The entry read, "They are not gone. They wait." The preservation was never the goal, it was the invitation. In the basement, investigators found several large containers filled with a translucent fluid, inside which rested faint outlines of human figures, half-formed, suspended as if caught between creation and decay. Whatever Charles had been doing, it seemed to blur the line between science and resurrection, echoing the very obsession that had defined the Halbert bloodline for generations. After that discovery, the mansion was once again sealed, but few believed it was truly empty. The story was far from over, as a distant relative would return to the estate, not to lay the past to rest, but to continue the family's terrifying work. When authorities sealed the Halbert mansion after Charles's disappearance, they intended it to be the final chapter in a story that had already spanned a century. Yet the house refused to fade into history. In the years that followed, strange reports resurfaced from those living nearby, flashes of light seen through boarded windows, faint vibrations in the ground during the quietest hours of the night, and an occasional low hum that sounded like a generator coming from deep beneath the earth. Local authorities dismissed these as the effects of settling foundations or passing storms, but residents who had grown up hearing the legend of the Halberts knew better. They said the house was breathing again, that something inside had awakened after decades of stillness. And though no one dared approach, those who drove past late at night swore they could see movement in the upper windows, like shadows pacing in slow, deliberate rhythm. It was around this time that a new pattern began. People in the surrounding area began reporting vivid dreams, all centered on the same recurring image, a vast, dimly lit room filled with glass coffins and the sound of ticking clocks. Some dreamers said they saw their own reflections among the preserved bodies. Others described a woman whispering to them from behind the glass, promising eternal peace if they would come home. Psychologists called it mass suggestion, but no one could explain why those dreams only occurred to people who lived within a 5-mile radius of the Halbert estate. Paranormal researchers quietly suggested that Charles's final experiments had created a kind of energy field, one that blurred the boundaries between life, death, and memory. A few dared to test the theory. In 2003, a pair of investigators set up motion sensors and cameras along the property's perimeter. They recorded nothing for 2 nights, but on the third, every device malfunctioned at precisely 3:11 a.m. When they reviewed the footage later, the cameras displayed static except for one frame. In it, the outline of a tall figure could be seen standing at an upstairs window, its face indistinct, but its hand pressed against the glass as though reaching outward. After that, both researchers abandoned the project, claiming they felt watched 4 weeks afterward. Since then, the mansion has stood untouched once more, its windows dark, its secrets sealed. Yet the air around it carries an almost imperceptible hum, a vibration too low to hear but impossible to ignore, as if the house is still waiting for the next soul bold or foolish enough to cross its threshold. By the time the 2010s arrived, the Halbert mansion had achieved near-mythical status. It had become a subject of documentaries, podcasts, and late-night radio shows that reveled in stories of haunted relics and cursed families. Urban explorers from across the country were drawn to it, each determined to be the one to capture definitive proof of what lingered within its rotting walls. Most who tried never made it past the iron gate. The air itself seemed to repel them, heavy, motionless, and humming with a low static charge that made their skin prickle. But in 2012, one group managed to break through a side entrance and record what would later become one of the most infamous pieces of footage in paranormal history. They called it the Halbert tapes *, though no one could ever agree on exactly what the footage showed. The explorers entered just after midnight, their cameras flickering as they stepped through the grand hall. Everything was coated in a fine layer of white dust, and yet the furniture looked undisturbed, as if time had paused mid-breath. One of them remarked that it felt too clean, that decay had stopped short of consuming the house entirely. As they moved deeper, the air grew colder, their breath visible in the camera light. In the parlor, the group found a set of covered shapes draped in thick white sheets. At first, they thought they were old furniture, but one explorer lifted the corner of a cloth and froze. Beneath it was a figure, human-shaped, glossy, and pale. The skin was stretched and smooth, almost translucent, the veins faintly visible beneath the surface. It wasn't a mannequin. It wasn't entirely human anymore either. Moments later, the audio captured a sound like a deep exhale echoing through the room. The camera dropped, and the footage blurred into chaos, flashes of movement, screams, and then complete silence. When the device was later recovered near the mansion's entrance, the group was nowhere to be found. Authorities scoured the house but found no trace of anyone. The interior was spotless, as though no one had entered at all. The footage, despite its grainy quality, spread online and became an obsession among those fascinated with cursed phenomena. Some claimed to hear faint whispering in the background of the video when played at low speed, others insisted that the shapes under the sheets had changed positions between frames. Regardless of interpretation, the recording reignited belief that the Halbert mansion was not just haunted, but alive, aware of those who entered, and unwilling to let them leave unchanged. In the years following the disappearance of the explorers, the Halbert estate was finally sealed by local authorities, its grounds fenced off and patrolled to deter thrill-seekers. Yet, even isolation could not silence the rumors that continued to circulate. Strange lights were often reported in the windows despite the property having no power source, and neighbors claimed to hear faint piano music drifting across the valley at night, always the same melancholy tune said to have been composed by Lillian Halbert herself before her death. Some nights, those who dared to approach swore they saw silhouettes moving across the upper floor, their shadows flickering as though illuminated by unseen candlelight. It was as if the mansion was still living through its own forgotten memories, replaying fragments of the past for an audience that no longer existed. In 2019, a team of researchers specializing in environmental phenomena gained temporary permission to enter the estate, hoping to disprove the legends through scientific observation. What they found only deepened the mystery. Instruments malfunctioned almost immediately upon entering, with compasses spinning wildly and temperature sensors showing impossible fluctuations from freezing cold to stifling heat within the same room. One researcher described feeling as though the house was breathing, the walls expanding and contracting subtly with each inhale of wind that passed through. In the library, the team uncovered notebooks belonging to the late Dr. Amos Halbert, who had been presumed dead since the early 1900s. The pages were filled with frantic sketches and notes describing experiments in soul transference and biological resonance, suggesting that he believed consciousness could be stored within organic material, preserved beyond death. The researchers left after just 6 hours, shaken and unwilling to speak publicly about what they'd witnessed. However, one of them anonymously leaked several pages of Halbert's notes online. In them, Amos described how the house itself had become an extension of his work, a living organism feeding on emotion, memory, and time. He referred to it as the vessel, claiming it would sustain his family indefinitely as long as the structure remained intact. This revelation sparked renewed public interest, drawing both skeptics and believers back to the property's edge. The final and most chilling account came from a drone operator who attempted to film the interior through a broken window. Midway through the recording, the drone froze midair, its camera feed showing what appeared to be a reflection not of the room, but of a figure standing directly behind the lens. The drone crashed moments later, its footage corrupted except for a single frame, the faint outline of the mansion's grand staircase, and at its base, 12 motionless shapes draped in white, perfectly still, as though waiting for the next curious visitor to join them. Even in the modern era, with all our technology, the Halbert mansion continues to guard its secrets, as a team of researchers would discover when their high-tech equipment revealed something impossible. After the drone footage leaked, the Halbert estate became a forbidden fascination for paranormal enthusiasts, historians, and internet theorists alike. Online forums dissected every frame of the video, enhancing the single intact image until details began to emerge. The white drapery looked more like burial shrouds, and the still forms beneath them seemed almost too defined, as if preserved. Some believed they were mannequins or props left by previous owners, but others were convinced the Halberts themselves had never truly decayed. Soon after, local law enforcement was forced to increase patrols around the property due to an influx of trespassers attempting to catch their own glimpse of what they called the preserved 12. Despite multiple arrests and warnings, people continued to arrive, drawn by something they couldn't explain, a compulsion to see what should not be seen. In 2021, a team of investigative journalists from a well-known documentary channel managed to gain sanctioned access for a short filming session. Equipped with modern cameras, radiation detectors, and drones, they intended to finally demystify the legends surrounding the family. What began as a skeptical exploration quickly shifted into something far darker. In the footage that survived, their entry into the house is met with an almost tangible heaviness in the air, a silence broken only by the faint groan of the floorboards and the flutter of disturbed dust. As they moved deeper inside, they began to encounter rooms untouched by time, furniture still arranged neatly, dishes left on tables, and portraits staring down from soot-streaked walls as though in silent judgment. In the main parlor, one camera captured what looked like movement, a curtain shifting without wind, followed by a faint whispering sound that none of the crew heard in the moment but appeared clearly in the audio playback later. The team never reached the basement, where local legend said the family had conducted their strange preservation rituals. Midway through filming, one of the journalists abruptly fell ill, complaining of nausea and disorientation. Instruments recorded sudden drops in air pressure and temperature, followed by static interference that rendered most equipment useless. They left within an hour, abandoning much of their gear. Days later, the same journalist reportedly began experiencing vivid dreams of the mansion, seeing the hallways in perfect detail, despite never descending into its lower levels. In one account, he described being guided by a soft voice that called his name from the dark. Within weeks, he vanished without a trace, his car found abandoned near the property's edge. The rest of the team refused to speak publicly about the incident again, and the footage they released was abruptly taken down after a cease and desist from an unknown entity. Only fragments remain online, grainy and incomplete, yet they continue to feed the growing myth that the Halberts' influence stretches far beyond their rotting home. By the time rumors of the vanished journalist had spread across the internet, the Halbert estate had transcended from local folklore into a global obsession. It became the centerpiece of countless podcasts, Reddit threads, and late-night YouTube investigations, each layering new speculation atop decades of unanswered questions. Yet, among the noise, one theory began to gain disturbing traction, that the Halberts had succeeded in creating a self-sustaining form of existence, one that blurred the line between physical death and spiritual persistence. Amateur researchers began comparing aerial images taken over the years, noting something unsettling. The vegetation surrounding the mansion appeared to grow in unnatural symmetry, forming what some claimed resembled human outlines when viewed from above. Botanists dismissed the idea as pareidolia, but locals who had lived near the estate for generations insisted the trees and vines seemed to shift with the seasons, rearranging themselves as though following some silent design. A university team attempted to conduct a botanical study in 2023 to verify these claims. When they entered the grounds, they noted that the soil surrounding the mansion was unusually rich in organic matter, unnaturally so, as if replenished from within rather than by decomposition. Their samples revealed traces of protein compounds not typically found in plant life, suggesting an exchange between the organic structure of the house and the earth itself. One professor remarked in a confidential report that the house may not be decaying, it's adapting. The report was never published, and months later, the university withdrew all records of the project from public access, citing ethical and environmental concerns. Only a few screenshots of the documents leaked online, but they painted a haunting picture, one of a building that might not just contain the dead, but feed upon their essence, transforming it into something perpetual and unending. As word spread, a cult-like following began to emerge, calling themselves the Custodians. They claimed to be descendants of those who once served the Halberts and believed it was their sacred duty to protect the estate from desecration. Anonymous posts from supposed members began appearing in dark web forums, warning outsiders to stop disrupting the vessel. In one chilling message, a custodian claimed that the mansion was never meant to hold corpses, it was meant to evolve them. Satellite footage from 2024 appeared to show faint, shifting illumination beneath the soil near the property's foundation, a phenomenon dismissed by experts as thermal distortion but hailed by believers as proof that the Halberts' creation was still active. Whether natural or supernatural, the estate remained untouched by demolition efforts, and local records show that every attempt to acquire the land had been mysteriously blocked. The mansion still stands, overgrown yet intact, its windows dark and unyielding, guarding whatever unfinished purpose the Halberts left behind. The most terrifying revelation of all would come from the Halberts' own journals, which revealed their true goal was not to preserve the dead, but to transform the house itself into something alive. The final chapter of the Halbert story, though recent, is perhaps the most unsettling because it demonstrates the enduring reach of their obsession across time. In the mid-2020s, a team of investigative journalists, inspired by decades of rumors, decided to document the estate using the latest technology, thermal cameras, drones equipped with high-resolution sensors, and bioacoustic recorders capable of detecting even the faintest vibrations. They arrived expecting an abandoned property, a decayed relic of a family consumed by its own eccentricities. What they found instead suggested that the house had never truly been empty. Even from the perimeter, drones picked up faint thermal signatures that moved unpredictably, as if something or someone was pacing inside, yet the mansion's doors and windows were locked from the inside. The bioacoustic sensors captured low-frequency vibrations that didn't correspond to any known mechanical or natural phenomenon, almost like a heartbeat resonating through the foundations. Inside the mansion, the team found evidence that the Halberts' rituals had extended beyond simple preservation. The upper rooms contained intricate glass cases, some cracked and dusty, while others were pristine, as though recently tended. A faint chemical odor still lingered, a mix of antiseptic, resin, and something sweetly organic. One investigator noted that the dust across the floors seemed to avoid footprints, almost as if the house itself were selectively preserving the environment. The cameras recorded shadowy movements at the periphery of the frames, figures that appeared briefly and then vanished without sound. When playback was slowed, subtle patterns emerged, shapes that resembled human silhouettes in the windows, mirrored across different rooms, as if the Halberts' presence had permeated the very structure of the building. The team also discovered a hidden study, its walls lined with journals that spanned over a century. The entries detailed the family's meticulous methods for suspending decay, the chemical formulas they experimented with, and notes on psychological conditioning, both for themselves and anyone who dared approach the estate. One passage described the house as a living vessel, designed to sustain not just bodies, but consciousness. According to the text, the mansion itself was part of the preservation process, its walls acting as a conduit between life and whatever lay beyond. Though the journalists left unharmed, several reported feeling a persistent unease in the weeks that followed, dreams filled with corridors of glass coffins, the faint sound of piano keys echoing in empty rooms, and the sensation of being watched wherever they went. These experiences mirrored those of previous visitors across generations, suggesting that the Halberts' legacy was not confined to the house itself but had extended outward, embedding itself into memory and perception. Today, the estate remains untouched, fenced off and shrouded in local superstition, a monument to a family whose refusal to accept death has left an indelible mark on both the physical world and the collective consciousness of all who dare to remember. As the shadows of this unsolved mystery fade into the past, the secrets of history await you. Subscribe now to Secrets of History, and join us as we unearth more chilling tales from the abyss of time. Hit that bell icon, and let the past whisper its truths to you next time.